I just want to say welcome to everybody. This is our intermediate leadership profile program. It's our diversity town hall with Dr. Mario Norman, a professor of marketing here at Clayton State University. My name is Daryl. I'm going to be the moderator for this town hall. And what we're going to do is, if everybody could keep their mics off and their cameras off for now. As Dr. Norman is presenting, he's got a PowerPoint presentation for us. But if you want to put any sort of questions in the chat line, or if you want to raise your hand, we can go ahead and get some discussion going that way as well. At the end, we can do a Q&A as well. So if you don't get a chance to ask your question, or if we're moving just a little bit too quick, make sure you keep your question for us, and you can always put it in the chat line, or during the Q&A, you can unmute yourself and we can get that discussion going. All right, so without further ado, Dr. Norman, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate having you. Take it away.
All right, thank you. This is quite new in terms of talking about diversity through this virtual space. As I talked about earlier, I really like to walk around the room and kind of catch up on some of the nonverbals as I talk about some of these topics here. For many people, talking about diversity becomes really uncomfortable, but it's important that we kind of work through that. So let me open up the slides here. All right, so Diversity Town Hall Student Leadership Series. So we'll just start off just talking about defining what culture is. Culture refers to the cumulative deposit of knowledge, experiences, beliefs, values, attitudes, and religion by a group of people, generally without anyone even thinking about it. It's, as some people would say, it's like water fish swim in, it's just there. It's like the air that we breathe. And through this culture, we have what I like to call cultural filters. This helps us to interpret the world. An example of how these cultural filters play a part in terms of how we interpret things that are around us. A prime example is what's currently taking place with Dr. Fauci with the mask. How is it that one group of people can simply say that, can hear the exact same thing from Dr. Fauci and simply say that we really need to wear the mask. And another group of people will simply say, no, that really doesn't make sense. So part of this kind of comes from our experiences, our knowledge, and our beliefs and values. Another example of how cultural filters play a role in terms of how we interpret the world. I'm not sure if anyone ever experienced going to a department store. And in this department store, a person may simply ask, may I help you? And you simply politely say, no, I'm just looking. And 5 minutes later, as you move on to the other side of the room, the person again asks, may I help you? What are you thinking? This person asked you 2 times within the span of 10 minutes, and you say that, no, I'm okay, I'm just looking. One person may simply say that this person thinks that I'm about to steal something. And another person may simply say this person is an overzealous salesperson trying to get a commission. The exact same scenario occurred, but yet they interpret it differently. And part of that kind of comes from cultural filters. And throughout my interpretation of most events, things like that takes place. So what is diversity? Diversity is real or perceived differences among people that affect their interactions and relationships. And some of the key differences include race, ethnicity, gender, religion, physical and mental abilities, sexual orientation. What I find when I typically do these diversity workshops, oftentimes people quickly think about race. Yes, race is a big part of what diversity is, but that's not the only piece of what diversity is. And in this diversity, oftentimes they are based on power or dominance relationship between identity groups. And an example of how these power dynamics work is if you ever gone into a group where people are different from you, do you change your mannerism? Do you change the way you speak? Do you code switch essentially? And what's the reason for code switching? And what's the reason for you to feel that it's necessary for you to change who you are? A lot of that kind of comes from how we tend to look at this power or dominance relationship between these different groups. And as we look at these key differences, it's really based on hierarchy, on social hierarchy. For instance, if we look at race, there's colorism within race and practically in most ethnic groups, whether it's from the Asian background, where research has shown that many people with the Asian background have begun to get surgery to reduce the slanting of the eyes to look more American. And I'll come back to what American looks like. Also within the Black community, where there's a hierarchy, the lighter skin you are higher up on the social hierarchy in terms of what's considered beautiful or attractive. So again, these key differences within these groups play a role in terms of the power. Power is an important part of these differences in terms of diversity. Inclusion. The degree to which different voices of a diverse organization or department are respected and heard. In inclusive organizations, members, students, employees, they feel accepted, feel a sense of belongingness, contribute to the decision-making process. The important piece about this here is that it's not only about numbers. Inclusion does not necessarily mean just because you have X amount of females or X amount of people of color within an organization that there's inclusion that's there. You may have it in numbers, but there's no, if you go back and take a look at what it talks about in terms of inclusive organization, the feeling of acceptance and feeling a sense of belongingness, that plays a role in terms of what inclusion really is. So oftentimes in some of these discussions, I have a question and I like to ask, do you see the United States of America as a melting pot or a salad bowl? It's interesting in terms of some of the perception or some of the answers I received for this. So first, if we look at a melting pot, this is where all people work, play together, and basically you hear a lot of people, particularly those of the privileged group or power group, they said, yes, the United States is a melting pot. But let's really look at this. Are we really? Or a salad bowl where people stick together in their groups but interact with people outside of their groups only when needed, like work. So in your mind, when you hear the word all-American male, what comes to mind? Or when you hear someone says all-American female, or that person looks like the boy next door or the girl next door. So what comes to mind there? So are we really a melting pot? Although you hear a lot of people talk about the United States being a melting pot where we all come together. And again, we're talking about these context clues or how people tend to look at it. And people may view that differently. People may do that differently because based on someone's perception, we're more of a salad bowl. So here becomes the question again. So how would you describe Clayton State? Is Clayton State a melting pot or a salad bowl? Or even within your department, is it a melting pot or a salad bowl? From my perspective, we're more like a salad bowl. Those within the privileged group oftentimes say that we are where we all come together as a melting bowl, but more of a salad bowl. So one of the biggest issues is that culturally speaking, we as a nation have difficulty thinking of anybody who does not have white skin or whose first language isn't English, just American. So as we go back to what I was just talking about before, if you ever hear someone talking about a movie and they say, oh, that person looks just like the person next door, who is that person? And what does that person look like? What are the demographics of that particular person? However, even when acknowledged that non-whites are American, they are subcategorized as something along the line as African American or Asian American. For those who have some experience outside of the United States, if you ask someone what is American, oftentimes that's someone who is white. And there's power in that. There's power in that. Prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. Prejudice is the negative attitude. toward a group of people based on their membership of that particular group. A stereotype is a generalization about a group of people within that particular group. Discrimination is the action. So if I back up and ask the question, does prejudice is it still around? Is racism still around? Is sexism still around? Some would argue that no, not so much so. I had a conversation with a neighbor talking about how racism has really gone away. However, those who experience racism, you simply say, where did you get this? Where do you get this from? Again, based on his cultural filters, he had very little interaction with people of color. His idea is that prejudice, things have gotten so much better than what it used to be. Perhaps so in some regard, but not necessarily. So if we look at prejudice, the attitude, stereotype is the generalization, and discrimination is the action. Oppression. Oppression is the systematic mistreatment of one group of people by another group of people in which there is an imbalance of institutionalized power. So in this oppression, there's systematic mistreatment refers to the methodical and widespread way. For instance, if you are part of a marginalized group, whether you are a sexual minority, whether you are a woman, whether you are a person of color, if you happen to walk into for an interview, and sometimes you can feel whether this place there's some sense of acceptance of you or not. And sometimes it's hard to describe that to people who don't necessarily have to deal with that. You can feel that as soon as you walk in, but the challenge is describing that to someone who doesn't necessarily have to deal with that. And in this imbalance of institutional power, this kind of creates a sense of oppression. And again, it's a systematic mistreatment of one group of people by another group of people in which there's an imbalance of institutionalized power. And in this oppression, it leads to this unearned privilege. An unearned advantage or immunity granted to or enjoyed by persons in a dominant group beyond the common advantage of all others. It's interesting that many times people who have this privilege, they don't necessarily see it. An example that I can come up quickly about unearned privilege is that, for those who know me personally, know I have this love-hate relationship with hip hop. So as a youngster, remember being in college, I was listening to some hip hop with a lot of vulgarities in it. And of course, it was really degrading towards women. And of course, my mother asked the question, why are you listening to this? And immediately I said, Mom, it's just music. What's the problem? And so she was livid. She was upset. And I remember my dad looking at me like, son, I can't really help you on this one. And so fast forward, I have 2 daughters. And now I'm constantly thinking that I cannot believe what they're playing on the radio. I cannot believe it. Even though they're skipping over some of the words, it's obvious what those words are saying. It's demeaning towards women. Now, again, my perspective shifted on the music because I have this connection to women. And again, if we look at what I talked about earlier here, is that many times privilege is not recognized until it's seen through a shared experience with another who does not share in that privilege. Now, granted, I have a sister who are 10 years younger than I am, and I didn't want her listening to that music at that time. But it didn't necessarily feel the same as when it's my daughters listen to the music. When the music talks about drop it like it's hot, oh no, my daughter's not dropping it like it's hot. I feel some kind of way about that where it's viewed differently. As a youngster, I'm listening to the music, it's okay. Another example of this unearned privilege is that when we talk about, here's some examples of privilege, right? Male, white, Christian, heterosexual. When we think about here in the United States, because sometimes when I talk about privilege, I get pushed back to say, this is something that people just kind of make up or kind of making excuses about certain things. And my response to this typically is that if it required the Supreme Court of the United States to get some type of basic right to do whatever, If you didn't necessarily have to have the Supreme Court to help you do something, then perhaps you're part of that privileged group and you don't necessarily see it, whether it's voting, whether it's whatever, you know. So those who have privilege, oftentimes they don't necessarily realize that they have that privilege unless something really close to them, something really happens. Unless they, again, they see it through somebody else's perspective. The importance of understanding some of the topics that we just kind of discussed here is that when those who are marginalized see an institution, department, or organization that is primarily white, but when they see that people at the upper levels of administration or the leadership team is primarily male and white, the message taken away is unmistakable and profound. Many see this as the chances of doing well at that institution are stacked against them. So it's very likely many people within this group who's listening to this talk here have heard similar messages such as, because you are blank and blank, you have 2 strikes against you. Or you have to work at least twice as hard to get blank or blank. So if I asked the question, how many people heard that before? And it's interesting to figure out whether or not hearing these, what does that do to you? You know, does it motivate you? Does it make you feel like you probably, if you're using a baseball analogy, if you only have 3 strikes and you already have 2 strikes as soon as you walk up to the plate, are you likely to swing for the fences, or are you just trying to get on base, using that analogy? So some would argue that some see this as hearing these messages, they see this as motivation, and others kind of feel like basically you just have to protect the plate and just do the best that you can with the tools that you have. These glass ceiling messages are very powerful in that as soon as people walk in, they have this perspective that perhaps it doesn't feel very inclusive, and I'm not sure how long I can stay here. Some of the reasons for the continuation of these isms, again, so when I talk about isms, I'm talking about racism, sexism, classism, and some of the others. One is realistic conflict theory, and this suggests that limited resources lead to conflict between groups and result in increased prejudice and discrimination. One piece here is scapegoating. And you hear this sometimes now, given in the political climate that we have now, particularly as we look at how it's viewed towards immigrants, and more specifically, people of Mexican descent. You hear language such as people coming across the borders to take our jobs. And again, part of the reason as to why this comes into place is because people see that there's limited resources and they need to do whatever is necessary to protect those jobs. And again, some of this is in terms of how they view it is more perceptual as opposed to being real. The social cognition piece, some studies have suggested that automatic prejudice can be triggered when certain ideas about the target group come to mind. One example is illusory correlation, blaming the victim, self-fulfilling prophecy. If we keep it in current, an example of the blaming the victim piece or social cognition piece, Jared Kushner, who is President Trump's son-in-law, as he recently said, something to the fact of President Trump's policies could help Black people break out of the problems that they are complaining about. But President Trump can't necessarily want them to be as successful as they want them to be. So in other words, the way some people perceive this as far as what he stated is that many Black people don't necessarily want to be successful. And again, if you kind of go back to what I talked about earlier about the cultural filters, some will argue that perhaps he's right. And many others have said, no, you blame the victim here. If you think about all the issues that have taken place that Black people and people of color have to deal with on an institutional, from an institutional standpoint, there are far more challenges than actually you can see because you don't understand. Then, of course, we have the self-fulfilling prophecy just as well. An example of this self-fulfilling prophecy, if you work, let's say you work at a restaurant and you feel that this particular group here doesn't tip, how does that impact your behavior towards that particular group? So let's say if you have table A compared to table B, table A, you feel like that they will tip. Table A, you feel like that table will not tip. If you go to table A, the one that you think that will tip, you're likely to create conversation with them and be pretty pleasant. For table B, you're probably likely just, what can I get you? And that's it. At the end, which table more likely to tip you? Well, you provided more service better service to table A, not paying attention, not knowing exactly, not being self-aware. You provided better services to table A, so of course table A will likely provide you with a better tip. Table B, you'll simply say, see, I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. This also goes into this confirmation bias piece as well with this self-fulfilling prophecy. Then you have normative rules. In society in which racism and sexism are institutionalized, normative conformity leads to the tendency to go along with the group in order to fulfill their expectation and gain acceptance. And this is modern racism. For the most part, if we look at normative rules, we are a conforming society. An example of what's meant by this conforming society is that if a person, let's say you are going to a social gathering with a friend. Now, this is after COVID, of course. If you go into a social gathering with a friend that you've never gone to this social gathering before, but your friend has, one of the first questions you're likely to ask is, what are you wearing? What is the importance of that particular question in terms of what you're wearing? It's because you want to conform. And so when we look at normative rules here, we know that racism exists. We know that sexism exists, but it's been existing forever, right? So why haven't we done anything about it? Part of this, again, is this is the way it always has been. This is the way it will be. And this is the way, again, this is all part of the normative rules.
So Dr. Norman, we had one question in the chat line. Seems like a good spot for it.
Sure.
Sindora Tillman asked, like, what are some good examples of ways to use your privilege to help others? And seeing how there's different levels of that.
Oh, yes, there's a great question. There are several ways in terms of the first way. I get that question for those who really want to have some understanding is really is to understand yourself first, because most people who are part of the marginalized group, they don't want any handouts. They want a sense of equality. So part of that comes from once you have a clear understanding of who you are, particularly that privileged group. I like go back to the example that I talked about with me, where I didn't necessarily realize that I had the privilege that I have as far as being a male until I had daughters. So now I've become more of an advocate, like even more so than my wife, where I say, I can't believe that this stuff is on the radio. And I oftentimes have these conversations with my daughters in terms of why this isn't appropriate, even though you may hear your friends sing this or do this or what have you. So part of it is having some self-awareness. So for those who have privilege, I think the best way that anyone who has privilege is self-awareness. That is the beginning of any assistance. Hopefully that answered. Illusionary correlation as part of the social cognition in terms of how some of the continuation occurs. Like given the case, a vivid case of 9/11, if we ask the question of who's more likely to be a terrorist in the United States, if you take a look at the slide here, most people would simply say, according to the study, identify the people of Islam faith as being more likely to be terrorists. But as we look at it, if we look at the terrorism piece there, the bubble there, that's a small amount of what terrorism is. But yet we tend to, when I say we here in the United States, we tend to look at it differently. The just world phenomenon, just well, for those who are privileged, within those privileges, you see the world is just. Only thing you have to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make it work. Whereas those with little justice, if you look at the small fish there, let's say if you come from a family with very low income, as a person of color who has all these what's identified as some of the that's not privileged, you have to work even as like one study that I just heard about where even people of color currently still, however, receiving mortgage rates at a higher interest rate. Things like that occur. And so that small fish would simply say, there's no justice in the world. Whereas if you look at the big fish there, you say, I went to school, I did all of this and I did that. And I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and I made it work. And again, if you look at that little fish, it's hard to become that big fish when you have so many challenges in front of you. And so too often, people who happen to be the big fish there, their cultural filters are certainly different from those of the small fish there. So looking at some of the research, one major way to reduce the ism is contact hypothesis. This comes from the field of psychology, where it talks about the more contact you have with people who are from a different background than you, you're less likely to generalize that particular group, because now you're able to put a name with that particular group. So in a meta-analysis of 500 studies from the University of California, it was found that contact helped to reduce a lot of prejudice feelings. However, those stereotypes didn't necessarily change, but people did grow to respect and somewhat like the person who, even though they had a stereotype about them. The reason contact worked was not purely or even mostly cognitive, but it was more emotional. Because here again, now you gain some empathy about that particular person because you see that person as a person as opposed to that group. And once you happen to get to know someone personally, that's a bit different than just labeling that person part of a group. Another piece of reducing the isms, multiculturalism. In multiculturalism, this is a view that cultures, races, and ethnicity, particularly those of marginalized groups, deserve acknowledgement and their differences within a dominant group. So it also makes it okay for those who are part of those marginalized groups to assimilate as well, if that's what they choose to do so. From a multicultural standpoint, this deals more so with everyone should be accepted as to who they are, as opposed to forcing them to assimilate. However, if you would prefer to assimilate, that's okay too. Just multiculturalism. Cultural competence is another piece. Cultural competence is the effective use of social and interpersonal knowledge and skills that demonstrates understanding and appreciation of individuals and group differences and similarities. Generally, cultural competence is the ability to work and communicate effectively with people of different backgrounds. So this is much more than tolerance. It's quite interesting how sometimes people say that this organization or this department or this group is very tolerant. But for those who belong to a marginalized group, when you hear that, they argue, many times will argue that tolerance just means that you only deal with me because you have to, not because you want to. And there's a difference there. When you invite me in compared to when I'm forced in, it feels different. So cultural competence is an ongoing process. It's not an endpoint event, meaning that capability can be continuously enhanced over time. So one theory of cultural competence, I like Sue's model, which is, 3 major points: awareness, knowledge, and skill. Awareness is the beginning of any change. You have to be aware, have some awareness of that there needs to be a change. You have to have some awareness in terms of what can you do to change, even within yourself. So awareness is the ability to recognize your own cultural conditioning. Much of the research suggests that we all are biased and that we all are conditioned. Then we have knowledge. Knowledge is trying to understand who you are, understanding your own culture, understanding your worldview and how it may impact others. Skill is where the diversity training come into play. So once you have awareness, Then you begin to seek knowledge. And in this knowledge, you try to acquire skills. So for an organizational standpoint, awareness, knowledge, and skill, these three key points here are important. So more specifically, if we look at our own cultural conditioning, our own biases, then we begin to develop a cultural appropriate skill, and this comes with the training that may be necessary. An example of some training that's highly suggested is bias training, where much of the research suggests, as I talked about before, that we all are biased, and oftentimes unknowingly. Some research suggests that although we are biased, a lot of people simply say that they don't see color. And much of the research, again, strongly argues that yes, we do see color. Diversity and inclusion goals. Know your why. Organizations and department may set these goals and have a hard time sticking to them. Goals such as, we want to have X amount of women here, or X amount of people of color here, or what have you. But you don't necessarily, those companies or organizations or departments don't necessarily understand the benefit that diversity could add to the organization. Because once you begin just looking for sheer numbers, you may miss the point. There. And those who come in, who you are counting as diversity groups, they don't necessarily feel that inclusion. Collaborative approach. So generally who sets the department or organization goals are leadership. Those are the ones in leadership. Clayton State is an anomaly in that regard. However, Clayton State, in my opinion, still have its own set of issues in regards to this, just as any other organization, where leadership is typically men, and oftentimes white men. And so the question becomes, how can leadership recruit and retain diversity when there's a lack of understanding? If there's no collaborative approach, how can they recruit and retain? Then we look at beyond quotas. Again, it's not so much of the count of people of color, women, or other identified diversity. It's more so of actions. What can we do? What's the reasons behind it? And of course, the training, as I talked about earlier, about the cultural competency, this comes with the diversity training. If we look at our cultural awareness goals, if you would notice that I'm constantly talking about self-awareness. Self-awareness is the biggest piece of any diversity training, in my opinion. You have to understand who you are and how who you are impacts others, particularly if you are part of the privileged group. Know your own cultural background, recognize your stereotypes and biases, gain knowledge of cultural history, recognize the effects of the isms on others. And lastly, the goal of social justice is the full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. In this social justice, it includes a vision of society in which the distribution of resources is equitable and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. Research suggests that schools often reproduce rather than remedy the patterns of social exclusion and oppression seen in a larger society. So the key takeaway from this talk here is that social justice is a process and a goal. This is a continuation, should be a continuation of constant training. So see if we have any questions. So I'll just end there.
So at this time, we do have a lot of discussion going on in the chat, a lot of reaction to different topics that you've been talking about so far. I'd like to invite anybody who would like to unmute themselves and ask a question. If there's anything you want to talk about, there's been a few things about Clayton State and our makeup for diversity here. There's been a few points on inclusion and a few on biases. So if anybody would like to go ahead and ask those questions, please do so now.
Daryl, can you repeat that question?
Hey, Frank. So at this point, if anybody would like to unmute themselves and speak to something on diversity or inclusion or any of the topics that Dr. Norman was presenting on, feel free to raise your hand. And what I'll do is as you click on those raise hand options, I'll do my best to get to call on you in order, and we'll go from there. So Akua, I do see your hand up. You want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Won't allow me to unmute. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can.
Okay. So yeah, it was a lot of chat. But my main concern is, and I understand everything that you said, and thank you for the presentation. My main concern is the education of our of youth. Okay, and I mean our in the sense of all inclusive, no matter what the cultural background is in America. What I have found and what I have noticed, and I may be stretching this a little bit, that the segregation is still there as far as the educational piece. The lower income schools, the music classes, the music, you know, with the instruments and stuff have been taken out. Choruses have been taken out. Excel programs have been taken out. Advancement, connection to college level or bridging over to colleges have been taken out. Science programs have been taken out. And computers or technology advancement has been more advanced in the private school and the private platform versus the public platform that does have multiculturals. So how do you, with that backdrop I just gave, how do you see moving forward to mend or blend that divide?
All right, great question. What we do know as far as research suggests that the biggest predictor of, okay, let's back up just for a moment. The biggest predictor of many things is family income. The biggest predictor how well you perform on a standardized test, thus to get scholarships through college, is your parents' income. The biggest predictor of the type of healthcare you're able to receive, your parents' income or income. So economics play a large role in much of that. Unfortunately, that is true. You can look at Fulton County for that matter to take a look at even the, if you look at the standardized test scores of North Fulton compared to South Fulton, the same county schools, which they should have the same curriculum. But why is it? The question I have here is a rhetorical question. The question becomes, why is that North Fulton schools typically outperform South Fulton schools? And you can see that across the board. Income is a big predictor of a lot of that. So until there is economic opportunity for those marginalized groups, particularly if we look at the lower income, and unfortunately, when we typically see the lower income, you'll likely see more people of color there, more single parents there, those who actually need some more of assistance. So this is the institutional piece that I was talking about before. For those who are involved in those institutional pieces where it's against you, you feel it all the time. For those who are part of that big fish, they don't see any problem. They just simply see that you just have to work hard to get those scholarships. Those parents made bad decisions so while their children are in those particular schools, they just see the world differently. But to sum it up, I would say economic opportunity, that would be the quickest way to circumvent that. Now, unfortunately, there's no clear-cut answer.
Can I counter real quick, super
Sure.
quick, because I don't want to dominate or monopolize the time. So that I understand, and you did mention one of the largest counties here in the state of Georgia, which is Fulton County. However, the superintendents and the legislator actually dictates the budget that goes out to these schools and in their districts and locations. And I'm sure you didn't mean this when you said bad choice as far as their decisions, which was a reflection.
When I said what?
You said that the parents that's in the lower income counties, and you said the merge was because of the income divide. The income is the divide, And you said that parents that have made that bad choice
No,
where their
well,
schools, that was what you said. You said
okay. So
parents
let me,
made
if
a
I may,
bad quote. Okay, go ahead.
yeah. So what I was saying there, that some people would say have the perception that these parents made these bad decisions. So no, certainly I don't think that these parents made these decisions, because I think I'm first generation college student, and I didn't come from money. So I grew up in Chicago in a lower income area, so I'm very familiar with all that. And my parents worked their butts off, and we kind of still stayed in that same area. So no, I don't necessarily think that people of lower income made bad decisions. I just think there are institutional barriers that many people don't necessarily see or appreciate.
Thank you, Doctor.
Sure.
All right, Jimmy, I saw your hand next, and then Frank, we'll get to you right after.
I just wanted to say something about segregation, since she brought up the topic. Here in the state of Georgia, colleges are still segregated ever since like 10 years ago. October 13, 2020 marks the 10-year anniversary of public colleges in the state of Georgia being resegregated. Not in the same form as it was before, but now it is illegal for undocumented students and U.S. citizens to learn in the same classrooms at UGA, Georgia Tech, and Georgia College. That's all I wanted to say.
So you're saying that there is can you repeat that again? I'm sorry, I missed something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that today it's still illegal for undocumented students and U.S. citizens to learn in the same classrooms at UGA, Georgia Tech, and Georgia College. And that's something the Board of Regents enacted with their policy 4.16 and 4.34.
Interesting.
Okay, Frank, you wanna jump in?
Yeah, Jimmy, that's an interesting thing, but that's not what I wanted to say. That's a whole nother topic right there. So, Dr. Norman, can you speak to this issue? A lot of times people get, I think, diversity and classism mixed up. A lot of issues, or racism and classism, and a lot of times they believe that some things are, they attribute it to race, whereas it's really a classism issue. How can we help people see the difference, even though sometimes they overlap? Or how do we engage in that kind of work and trying to separate them, or see how, or can you separate the two rather?
So let me see where I can start. Racism and classism, many times there's an intersection. And so some will argue that there's a differences between racism and classism. Well, both of them, they're all part of diversity, because certainly those who, there's a differences in terms of each matter of conversations compared to higher income, compared to middle income, compared to lower income, in terms of just the conversational piece, mainly just based on exposure. Not that one is better than the other, but mainly because of exposure, such as for lower income compared to higher income, who's more likely to go on vacation out of town. So of course there be some discussions about their experiences. Racism and classism, how they intersect. The research suggests that if you are a person of color, if you're a higher income, you still have to deal with issues of the police. You still have to deal with issues of institutional racism within your place of work. And again, a lot of this has to do with cultural filters, because there may be some people of color, they don't necessarily see it as racism. So it's a matter of perception sometimes. However, again, the research still argues or suggests that whether your income is high or low, you're still a person of color if you still belong to a marginalized group.
Okay. And so, just as a follow-up question to that, I learned from being in your class last session that this stuff gets very uncomfortable anyway when you start talking about it. So what do you think is the greatest diversity challenge here at Clayton State?
You want to put me on the spot, talk about where
Well,
I'm
no,
employed,
I mean, I have my own thoughts, but but you're the scholar, so I think you can.
So there different ways of looking at it. You know, I appreciate the question. So a challenge that I see is making sure that we have resources for students, particularly as I stated earlier, I'm a first generational college student, so there's many times I've been in meetings before where the expectation is that students should be able to navigate, really focus on schoolwork more so than anything else. Again, as a first generational college student, sometimes you have other issues to deal with, such as where you're living, health, work. So I had to work while I was in school, and so I couldn't get 100% focus on graduate school because I had to work. And so the biggest challenge is having people in leadership positions to have some clear understanding of who our students are and some of the issues that they have to deal with. Because many times they come from different perspectives, where basically if they went to school, that's all they did was to go to school. I hope that helped.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That was a good way to say that. That's a good way to put that.
All right, does anybody else have any questions, any comments they want to bring up? Recent events, anything? So getting a lot of activity in the chat about the information that Jimmy brought up. What we can do is I put in my email address for him to send it in, and I can upload that to the files later for everybody. You should be able to access that. But if you don't get it for whatever reason, my info is in the chat. It says it's darylfedcheck@clayton.edu, and I can forward it to you a little bit later. Royal, I see your hand up.
Yes, I had a comment, and I'm not going to put you on the spot like Brother Frank did you, Dr. Norman. Sorry about that.
It's all right. It's all right.
No,
that
seriously.
Comes with the territory.
It comes with the territory. I wanted to say that your example of the salad versus the melting pot, I thought was an extremely critical example to be used when we start to talking about our conditions, breaking it down from our departments, our institutions, and even this country. And so as you were saying that, I was thinking that, even if we identify truthfully what the conditions of our areas or our departments, thinking about a melting pot, when things are in a melting pot or like a gumbo, it's hard to separate, right? You got to eat it all. You got to take the fork full with everything. But with a salad, you can pick it apart. And so I think that some people have a false sense of what they even want to see. It sounds good in theory that we want to be a melting pot. And this isn't my perspective. I'm just saying, we'll have people that say it sounds good. We want Clayton State to be a melting pot. But sometimes, people don't really mean that when they say that. They want to be able to pick out the tomatoes if they don't eat tomatoes, or if they don't want the cucumbers. You know what I'm saying? So how do we deal with that if someone is, feeling that and not showing those actions, but saying one thing?
Yeah, so that comes along with the multicultural piece. And I think the more we know, the more we have understanding, the better we can operate. So as long as we have our eyes open and we can see what's going on, like for instance, if we look at the multiculturalism, it really takes you who you are. And if a person wants to be removed out of the salad, that's okay, whereas being forced, when you hear the language of we're a melting pot and that we're not, that's where it becomes somewhat condescending, meaning that people don't necessarily feel like you really understand who they are. And so in terms of how do we manage that, how do we deal with that, from a multicultural standpoint, we accept people who they are.
Thank you. I completely agree. Thank you so much.
Derek, if I can, it was a piece that I've been asked before about condition. If I can just give a quick example of what I meant by that, I wanted to make sure that have some understanding of that conditioning piece.
Absolutely.
Because much of the research suggests that we all are biased, and oftentimes I get pushed back from that. And again, this is based on research. It's not something that I'm just saying. This is really based on research that we all are conditioned. Regardless if you were born here in the United States or if you were born elsewhere and immigrated to the United States, we all are conditioned. And so we have these different perspectives of the world, and we are these different cultural filters, as I talked about. So if I could just give a quick example of what I mean by that. So imagine that, let's say you had gone to a conference in a town that's outside of Clayton State, that you're in a different town and you go to this conference. And at this conference, you meet up with a friend that you had to take the rental car to go meet this friend. And so you decide to come back. It was late. Let's say it's probably about 11 o'clock at night. You're on your way back and you end up getting off the interstate too soon. And you're like, let me hurry up and get back on the freeway because this is unfamiliar territory. For me, you see the light is yellow, turn it red. You're like hoping that you can make it through, but you can't. You turn over, you look to your right, and you hear a boom, 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 knocking on your window. You realize at this point that you are being carjacked. Quickly, what does that person look like? What is that person's demographics? Now, the reason I use this example, I've given this example countless times, and I have an entire scenario that I use for this. I already pretty much know what this person looks like in terms of most people's minds. If this person, now you don't have to share who this person is, what this person looks like, but I really want you to pay attention to yourself. This is part of the self-awareness piece. What is this person's gender? What is this person's racial makeup? Does this person have hair or does this person not have hair? Different perspective about this particular person. So if you had to describe this person, what does this person look like? If this never ever happened to you before in your life, nor do you know someone personally who this happened to, how did this person come into your mind? And I'll just leave it there. That's the conditioning piece.
All right, at this time, if anybody have any other insight or questions? Akua, we have you one more time, and then I want to get into, and then Sandora will get to you as well, and then I want to get into a little bit of inclusion piece before we wrap. So Akua, do you have something?
Well, really quick, I'm sorry. So I worked at this company for 8 years. And everyone in my department was of a different marginal status, okay, using your words. And someone came into our department that worked less than 4 months in that particular department and was promoted to the management team. Now, there were several people in that department that exceeded expectations on a matrix level. There were several people that in that department that had the necessary background and credentials and educational credentials. With that being said, and to try to keep this as light as possible, what advice do you give the younger generation? Because I'm a little older, I'm probably could be somebody's mother at this point. But what advice would you give the younger generation when they see this, instead of them being proactive to say, hey, I quit and I decide to move on? Like, what advice would you give if it's right there in their face?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a reality for a lot of people. And just like I tell my daughters, unfortunately, the world isn't fair. That happens quite frequently, to be honest. And so, what we find that the research talks about for people within marginalized groups, whether you are a person of color, whether you're a woman, what have you, it's important that you have some ability to code switch. So it's important that you have to have some understanding of how to talk, basically how to talk to white people. And that may sound a bit condescending, but there's research to kind of back it up, where you have to be able to have the mainstream talk, to be able to talk within the mainstream and also talk to whatever your group is. Whereas it's different for white people. White people just have this one language, and oftentimes this is kind of carrying over to another piece. This is also oftentimes where first generational college students have some of the similar issues when they go to school because they don't necessarily understand, I'm saying college talk, but really is how mainstream talk. And so how should people deal with when you happen to see some of the discrimination that's taking place? I don't want to simply say you need to stay there, but you're absolutely right. Frank code switching, it becomes very exhausting. That's why I say it's unfortunate. And that may be your writing on the wall, so to speak, that you perhaps may not be welcome there, and get what you can out of there in terms of experiences, and begin looking elsewhere.
All right, Sindora, we have time for your question, and then I want to do a little inclusion challenge for everybody.
Okay, I actually have a comment. So my comment is, I had the opportunity last year to attend the National Student Leadership Diversity Conference. And at that conference, they basically taught us about being able to raise awareness, being able to increase our knowledge and development skills, and a plan for action as far as diversity and inclusion is concerned. And I wanted to know if Clayton State University, I transferred here, so I'm wondering, do they participate in the National Student Leadership Diversity Conference? And if not, is it possible for us to get some department to sponsor it so that we can start attending and learning? That's my question. I could put the link to their website in the chat if you all would like.
Daryl, do you want to tag me in?
Actually, I was about to, Royal. So, I think you're the best person to answer this question.
Well, now that you say that, I hope so. Sindora, thank you for that question. This is Royal, Dr. Baxter. And actually, at our institution for the last 11 years, we've hosted our own Diversity and Leadership Institute. And I hate that this is the year that you've transferred in during this global pandemic, so we have been unable to hold that annual event. But it is very similar to the event that you have just described with the NSLS, as we have challenged ourselves to provide opportunity and space for our students to gain the awareness and equip them with skills to be able to advocate for themselves in this realm of diversity and cultural inclusion. But to answer your question about sponsoring students to go, I think that is something that I will put you in contact with Ms. Tiffany Burston over at the Department of Campus Life and the Student Activities Center, who is the advisor for NSLS. And let's see if we can get some opportunities and information to you on the possibility of sponsoring some students, or possibility of hosting something again similar on our campus so that you can participate. I hope that helps.
Yes, ma'am, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dara, let me, if I may, clear this up about the code switching, because I'm sitting here thinking about it. I want to make sure that I want to emphasize I'm not suggesting that we should code switch, because I think we should be who we are. But I was just speaking more from a research perspective.
And code switching is something that, and I actually learned about in your class, Dr. Norman. So that's something that I feel like is an excellent point to bring up on campus.
And exhausting.
Yeah. So I did want to just wrap up with a little inclusion challenge. So if you look in the chat box, there's just a real quick, what are some obstacles to inclusion on campus, and how can we begin to overcome them? And in case you want to start working on something like that, sorry about the link being so big, but you can use this link to get back to the file that was uploaded earlier to the files. There's just a little worksheet that you can use in your off time, on your free time, to help you identify different inclusion hurdles and start to begin to identify ways to get over them. And if any of those ideas you want to share with the group, you can put them back in the chat later, or you can email them to me and I can send them out. At this time, Dr. Norman, did you have any final thoughts?
No, well, yes. Well, I appreciate your time, and cultural competence, that's an ongoing piece, and understanding social justice is also an ongoing piece as well, that hopefully that the university will continue to strive for that.
All right, well, everybody, thank you so much for attending our Diversity Town Hall with Dr. Mario Norman, Professor of Marketing for Clayton State. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to forward them, and we can help you out. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you for your time.
Hi, Carol. Before everybody leaves, I want to invite you all to our next leadership series, which will be tomorrow at noon. And it will be focusing on public speaking. So our guests will come from the local Toastmasters chapter. And so you're all invited to come and learn how important mastering public speaking is right now and in the future. Also, if you would like to be an active part of the program, please send me an email. Again, you're welcome to come and just participate and view it. However, there will be an opportunity for about 2 or 3 students to actively participate in the Toastmasters event tomorrow.
All right, and for a lot of you that are asking about a link to that, you can find those links on our social media pages, but I'll post up that flyer on the chat line in a few minutes. All right, at this point, thank you, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.